This all started on a sunny day in Beijing. It's the 3rd of June, 1989. Hundreds of thousands of students are participating in peaceful protests and demonstrations. These are taking place in one of the most popular areas in Beijing, Tiananmen Square. The protests and demonstrations aren't new. These kinds of protests have been going on ever since the 18th of April, 1989. The day passes, some students sleep in the square, but most will be back tomorrow. It's 1 a.m. in Beijing when the Chinese troops reach Tiananmen Square. This is not surprising. Martial law has been in place ever since Premier Li Peng imposed it. Throughout the day, Chinese troops fire on the civilian and student protesters. An official death toll was never released, but is expected to be anywhere from 180 to 10,454 civilian deaths. What happened in Tiananmen Square was horrifying and a violation of the democratic belief of freedom to assembly. In order to understand why this happened, we must first understand why the protesters were protesting. It all started with the death of Hu Yaobang, a former Communist Party leader. He died on the 15th of April, 1989. The reason his death was so important is because he had worked to move China to a more open political system and had become a symbol of democratic reform. The protests were to try and continue his dream of making China democratic. The government worked very hard to stop this reform, and this is why they imposed martial law, and why they fired on the peaceful protesters. The protesters were no match for the military. They did not fight back. The People's Liberation Army fired on unarmed, peaceful protesters so that they would not achieve their goal of a more democratic government and the ridding of corruption in the Communist Party of China. The incident of Tiananmen Square was not only a dismissal of the freedom to assembly, but in a way, it is a dismissal of every single democratic belief and value. Student and civilian protesters in Tiananmen Square were protesting for a more democratic government. They were fighting for an incorporation of more democratic beliefs, values, and rights. This means that in a way, but indirectly, they were putting every single democratic belief and value into conflict by denying the ability to have those in their government. Although, the main dismissals were freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. The Tiananmen Square Massacre relates back to chapters 6 and 7 of the textbook in many ways. One of the main ways is that China is a communist country, and different types of political ideologies are mentioned heavily in this section. Chapter 6 also talks about the transition to democracy, which is what the students and civilian protesters were attempting. The last main thing relating this incident to Chapter 6 is the section on taking civic action against non-democratic practices, which is also what the protesters were doing. I do not believe that the Chinese government took the appropriate action when dealing with the situation. My view on this incident is that it was a disgusting violation of human rights, and that it was a complete dismissal of democratic beliefs and values. All the protesters wanted was a more democratic government. They weren't breaking anything, they weren't hurting anyone, they were peaceful. The People's Liberation Army fired on a group of its own people, a group of peaceful protesters. Either way you put it, it sounds horrible. If you know the people they fired on were peaceful protesters and their citizens, it sounds horrible. It doesn't matter any way you say it. It sounds like an evil regime didn't have enough faith in itself to make sure they could keep operating as usual, so they committed an atrocity against its own people. It's terrible what they did. There are many ways that the government could have dealt with the conflict better. They could have negotiated terms to stop the protest. They could have let the protesters be, as there is no voting, so the protesters' opinions didn't even matter. The only thing the government accomplished by firing on the peaceful protesters was getting Western countries mad at them. In conclusion, the atrocity committed by the People's Liberation Army and the Communist Party of China could have been easily avoided with the right strategy and good thinking. Thank you for listening.